Hello and welcome to another video from the English at Penrice YouTube channel. Today we're going to be exploring the character of Inspector Goole from J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. If you're thinking about your exams, this video is going to help you with your revision for English Literature, Paper 2, Section A. Okay, let's start by having a look at some key information about this character. The inspector arrives, interrupting the Burlings as they celebrate Sheila and Gerald's engagement. This idea of interrupting as a result of his entrance is really, really important because he not only interrupts their party, but he also interrupts this worldview they have and this perception of how they live their lives. He changes the mood almost immediately on stage from something quite light-hearted and content to something much darker and intimidating. We know that Priestley suggested that the lighting should change as the inspector arrives from pink and intimate, suggesting a coziness and a warm contentment of the Burlings, to something brighter and harder, maybe suggesting that he's exposing their immorality. He's exposing the way that they live their lives and their thoughtless actions, and they can't hide behind the dimmer lighting. He questions each one of the characters in turn, so he tells them that it's the way he goes to work. He deals with one character at a time, and he forces them to confess their relationship with Eva and their immoral and thoughtless actions towards her. And he builds to the point where we realise that each of the Burlings and Gerald has had an impact on her decision to take her own life. Not only does he interrogate each of the Burlings, he also does so in a very controlling and commanding way. He takes complete control of the situation, often interrupting people like Mr. and Mrs. Burling when they try to gain power over him. He also uses quite gruesome imagery quite quickly when he arrives on stage to really emphasise the desperate nature of her situation and the awful way that she ended her own life in such desperate circumstances. And he's a really, really commanding character. He doesn't give in to Mr. Burling's attempts to intimidate him when Mr. Burling refers to high status members of the police force that he knows, or the fact that Mrs. Burling refers to her husband as an ex-Lord Mayor. He is not fazed by that at all. And then towards the end of the play, we realise that he's had a really significant impact upon Sheila and Eric in particular, upon the younger generation characters. And he admits himself actually that he's likely to have made an impression on the young ones. Not only obviously does this show that there's hope for the future, that the younger generation are open to change their perception of how society should work, but it also really allows those younger characters to appreciate the need for social reform and collective responsibility, something that Mr. and Mrs. Burling do not come to realise at all. At the end of the play, then, he is revealed, as Mr. Burling calls him, a hoax, and he's not a real police inspector. Gerald Croft leaves the house and finds out that there isn't an Inspector Goole on the police force. We, as an audience, are left to draw our own conclusions, make our own decisions about who we think Inspector Goole is. Perhaps he's a supernatural character, which would perhaps be suggested by his surname Goole, which is a homophone for the spelling Ghoul, particularly intimidating, scary spirit or demon. Perhaps he's the conscience of the Burling family, or perhaps he's a manifestation of Eva Smith herself as she searches for justice for herself. And then finally, why is Inspector Goole crafted in the way he is? Well, he is the mouthpiece of J.B. Priestley, the playwright's own views on society. J.B. Priestley was a staunch socialist, a left-wing writer who wanted much more equality and fairness and collective responsibility in society. And therefore he crafts this character to air his own personal views on how society should be run. So we say that he is the mouthpiece of Priestley's own perceptions and opinions. Okay, let's have a look at some important quotes then for this character. As he arrives on stage, the stage directions tell us that he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. He makes a real impression on stage. Not necessarily that he is a big character physically, but that his impression on the characters is very large and significant. He's not easily swayed, and it's obvious that he has a job to do and he's determined to do it. And that's obvious from the outset. And then we move on to looking at some of this gruesome imagery that he uses. He describes Eva as swallowing a lot of strong disinfectant, burning her insides out, of course, and ending her life in great agony. This really shocking, gory description is designed to shock the Burling straight away. It's a real wake-up call, or at least it's designed to be. When they realise that they're involved, all in their own individual ways, in Eva Smith's decision to take her own life, they might well reflect on how she did that and how distraught she must have been to end her life in such an agonising way. He refers to the lead up to Eva Smith's suicide as a chain of events. So each of the Burlings is a link on this chain, and when completed, unfortunately, ends in Eva Smith's suicide. As we can see by the next quotation, he's often very harsh with the Burlings. He's often very blunt. So we have this adverb stage direction, harshly. He doesn't worry about making the Burlings feel better about their immoral actions. He's very open and honest with them about how awful and thoughtless they've been and the consequences of that. Again, we've got these short, blunt, simple sentences. You can't. It's too late. She's dead. And that's to reinforce that actually there isn't a way out for the Burlings. They haven't escaped their guilt, certainly from his point of view. And then again, we have a stage direction speaking massively. Public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. This is referring to Mr. Burling's position in society, his position in the hierarchy of Brumley, as a prominent member of the town council. He did, obviously make some really significant decisions. However, and as previously as Lord Mayor, however, Inspector Goole tries to reinforce that he also has a responsibility to make sure his actions are thoughtful, to help those less fortunate than him, and to take this idea of collective responsibility into account, not just to enjoy the privilege of being a high status man in the town. And then we have a quotation that links to Inspector Goole's perception of gender. We have various references that suggest that suggest the gender inequality at play in Edwardian society in the play. But the inspector, obviously, in wanting equality and justice, wants gender equality as well. And he says to Mr. Burling, "Your daughter isn't living on the moon." Now, this sarcastic reply to Mr. Burling, suggesting that Sheila should be spared her exposure to some of the more difficult parts of the conversation the inspector's having with the Burlings, is a suggestion that actually Sheila is an independent young woman and person, and she is able to deal with the difficult nature of the interrogations. And then finally, his final speech uses a range of rhetorical devices or persuasive methods to finally make the Burlings realise the consequences of their actions. And this last phrase, "they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish," is particularly intimidating. and threatening for the Burling family. It maybe suggests the impending war, that if society does not come together and people do not accept their collective responsibility, then something awful will happen for society at large. So it could be referring to the world war that ensues, or it could be referring to hell, that if people don't accept their responsibility and they continue to act immorally, they will be punished in hell. And then finally, some sophisticated vocabulary to allow you to enhance your analysis of the inspector. The inspector is really assertive, so he's very confident. He isn't afraid to put forward his opinion and viewpoints very bluntly to the Burling family. He's very resolute, so he doesn't waver in his desire to get justice and to get what he wants out of the interrogation. He's very, very determined. He's very imposing, so he's quite intimidating and does have an impact upon the Burling family, who think they are very, very powerful. And he's very commanding over them too, as well as being intimidating. We can also use the adjective omniscient, which means that the inspector is all-knowing. He's very pragmatic, so he's a very thoughtful character. He deals with things one step at a time, and he's very rational about the way he goes about things and the way he questions people. He is a moral character, so he is concerned with behaviour that is right and kind and good, juxtaposing the immorality of the Burling family. At times he does become more emotional. He's very exasperated by the Burlings, especially Mr. Burling. He tells him to stop yammering and stammering at him. And he does become increasingly exasperated and frustrated, especially with the older generation, as they fail to take responsibility for their actions. His final speech can be described as very arresting, so we're quite taken aback by it, and it captures our interest. The way he delivers that final persuasive speech is very arresting for the audience as well as the family. He's very didactic in his character. So a didactic character is one who is designed to teach other characters a moral lesson, as well as the audience. And finally, he's very enigmatic. So he's quite mysterious as a character. We're not really sure who he is or where he's come from at the end. So that mystery surrounds him, and he is very much an enigma. Okay, that was an exploration of Inspector Goole from J.B. Priestley's and Inspector Goule's. If you sign up to the English at Penrice YouTube channel, you can get lots more videos to help you with your English literature and language revision.